The morning mist clung to the towering pines like ghostly fingers as 8-year-old Emily McCready stepped onto the wooden porch of their modest cabin. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the scent of fresh sawdust from her father's lumber mill drifted through the valley. Thomas McCready was already at work, his powerful arms swinging the heavy axe with the rhythm that had earned him respect throughout Cedar Falls, their small frontier town nestled in the Montana Territory. "Whiskers, where are you going?" Emily called softly to the family's tabby cat, who was padding purposefully toward the dense forest that bordered their property. The cat's tail twitched with unusual urgency, and instead of his typical lazy morning stretch, he seemed determined to reach something deep within the woods. Emily glanced back at the cabin where her mother, Sarah, was preparing breakfast. The familiar sounds of crackling bacon and brewing coffee created a comforting backdrop to the crisp morning air. But something about Whisker's behavior intrigued her. In her 8 years of life in this rugged territory, she had learned to trust the instincts of animals. They often knew things that people missed. "Wait for me," she whispered, grabbing her woolen shawl and following the determined feline into the shadowy embrace of the ancient forest. The towering trees seemed to lean in as Emily ventured deeper than she had ever gone alone. Whiskers moved with purpose, occasionally looking back to ensure she was following, his green eyes reflecting an intelligence that surprised her. The forest floor was soft beneath her worn leather boots, carpeted with decades of fallen leaves that rustled softly with each step. As they walked deeper into the woods, Emily began to notice things she had never seen before. Strange markings on some of the trees, not natural scratches from animals, but deliberate cuts that formed patterns. Some trees bore scars that looked like they had been marked by human hands, creating a trail that seemed to lead somewhere specific. "What are you showing me, Whiskers?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper in the cathedral-like silence of the forest. The cat finally stopped at the base of an enormous oak tree, its trunk so wide that Emily couldn't have wrapped her arms around even half of it. The tree was ancient, its gnarled roots creating natural seats and hiding places. Whiskers began pawing at a particular spot near the base, meowing insistently. Emily knelt beside him, brushing away the thick layer of leaves and forest debris. Her small fingers felt something hard beneath the soil, not a root, but something angular and foreign to the natural forest floor. With growing excitement and curiosity, she began to dig, using a flat stone to scrape away the earth. What emerged made her heart race with a mixture of fear and excitement. It was the corner of a wooden box, weathered but still solid, buried deliberately beneath the mighty oak. The wood was dark with age, and she could see iron hinges that had rusted but remained intact. Emily looked around the silent forest, suddenly aware of how far she had come from home and how alone she was. The morning sun filtered through the canopy above, creating dancing patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift and move around her. She could hear her father's voice in her mind, warning her about wandering too far into the woods alone. But Whiskers sat calmly beside the partially unearthed box, as if he had been waiting his entire life to show her this spot. His calm presence gave her courage, and Emily continued to dig, driven by a curiosity that was stronger than her caution. As more of the box emerged from the earth, she could see that it was larger than she had first thought, about the size of her mother's sewing basket, but heavier and more solid. The wood was carved with intricate patterns that spoke of skilled craftsmanship, and despite its age, the box had been well protected by the earth and the shelter of the great oak's roots. With trembling hands, Emily managed to free the box completely from its earthen grave. It was heavier than expected, and she had to use both hands to lift it. The metal clasp was corroded but not locked, and she realized that with a little effort she could open it right here. But as she prepared to lift the lid, a sound in the distance made her freeze, the sharp crack of breaking branches, as if someone or something large was moving through the forest. Whisker's ears perked up, and he looked alertly in the direction of the sound. Emily's heart pounded as she made a quick decision. Whatever was in this box had been hidden for a reason, and she sensed that it was something important, perhaps even dangerous. This was not the place to examine it. She needed to get it home, to safety, where she could look at its contents carefully and perhaps share the discovery with her parents. Wrapping the box in her shawl to muffle any sounds it might make, Emily followed Whiskers back through the forest, taking a different path that seemed more familiar. The weight of the box in her arms was nothing compared to the weight of questions in her mind. Who had buried this box? Why had Whiskers led her to it? And most importantly, what secrets lay hidden within its weathered wooden walls? As the familiar sight of their cabin came into view through the trees, Emily realized that this discovery might change everything. She had always been curious about her father's past. He rarely spoke of his life before coming to Cedar Falls, and her mother would change the subject whenever Emily asked too many questions. Now, carrying this mysterious box that had been deliberately hidden in the forest near their home, Emily sensed that she was about to uncover answers to questions she hadn't even known to ask. The morning that had started with such ordinary promise was about to become the beginning of an adventure that would test her courage and change her understanding of her family forever. Emily's hands trembled as she carefully set the mysterious box on her bedroom floor. The afternoon sun streamed through her small window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards of their cabin. Her parents were both busy, her father at the lumber mill and her mother tending to the vegetable garden behind their home. This was her chance to discover what Whiskers had led her to find. The metal clasp, though corroded with age, opened with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment. Emily held her breath as she lifted the heavy wooden lid, and what she found inside made her gasp in wonder and confusion. The box was lined with oiled cloth that had protected its contents from moisture and decay. Carefully arranged within were items that seemed to tell a story Emily didn't yet understand. At the top lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, the paper yellowed but still intact. Beneath that were official-looking documents with elaborate letterheads and wax seals that had long since lost their color. But it was the photograph that caught her attention first. It was a formal portrait of a family. A man who looked remarkably like her father, but wearing the uniform of a U.S. Marshal, complete with a silver badge that gleamed even in the old photograph. Beside him stood a woman Emily didn't recognize, and between them, 2 children who appeared to be about her own age. Emily's heart raced as she studied the photograph more closely. The man's strong jawline, his deep-set eyes, even the way he held his shoulders. It was definitely her father, but younger and wearing the symbol of law enforcement. Her father had never mentioned being a marshal. In fact, he had always told her that he had been a simple lumberjack his entire life. With careful hands, she untied the ribbon around the letters and began to read the first one. The handwriting was formal and urgent. Marshal Thomas McCready, your investigation into the Blackwood Mining Company has stirred dangerous waters. Evidence of their illegal land seizures and intimidation tactics against local farmers is mounting, but so is the threat to your safety and that of your family. Consider this a final warning. Abandon your pursuit of justice or face the consequences. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her father hadn't just been a marshal. He'd been investigating serious crimes. She quickly read through more of the letters, each one painting a picture of corruption, violence, and her father's determined fight for justice in a different territory, years before she was born. One letter was different from the others. It was in her father's own handwriting, addressed to someone named Captain Morrison. The Blackwood Mining Company has been systematically driving families off their land through intimidation and violence. I have documented evidence of at least 12 families forced to sell their property for far below its value, and 3 cases where houses were burned when the owners refused to sell. The company's enforcers, led by a man named Jake Thornton, have operated with complete impunity because they have someone inside the local government protecting them. I fear for my family's safety, but I cannot let these injustices continue. Emily's hands shook as she continued reading. Her father had been more than just brave. He had been a hero, fighting against powerful men who were hurting innocent families. But why had he never told her? Why did they live quietly in Cedar Falls, with him working as a simple lumberjack? The documents beneath the letters provided the answer. Official papers from the territorial government, transfer orders, and finally, a death certificate that made Emily's blood run cold. It was for Marshal Thomas McCready, dated 12 years ago, claiming he had been killed in the line of duty during a confrontation with outlaws. But her father was alive. She had seen him that very morning, heard his laugh, felt his strong arms as he lifted her for a goodbye hug before heading to work. How could there be a death certificate for a living man? As Emily studied the documents more carefully, she began to understand. Her father had faked his own death to escape the dangerous situation he had uncovered. The Blackwood Mining Company and their corrupt allies had become too powerful, too dangerous to protect his family, and Emily now realized this must have included her mother and possibly siblings she had never known about. He had staged his death and started a new life. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in another piece of oiled cloth, was a detailed map of the Cedar Falls area. Red marks indicated various properties, with notes in her father's handwriting. Emily's heart sank as she read the annotations. The Blackwood Mining Company hadn't disappeared when her father had faked his death. They had followed him here. The map showed property acquisitions over the past several years, a pattern of land purchases that was slowly surrounding their small town. Several properties were marked with ominous notes: family forced to sell, house burned, mysterious accident, cattle poisoned, children threatened, immediate departure. Emily realized with growing horror that the same corruption and violence her father had fought years ago had followed them to Cedar Falls. The Blackwood Mining Company was still operating, still terrorizing families, and still using intimidation and violence to steal land. And from the dates on the map, their activities had increased significantly in recent months. The final document in the box was the most recent, a letter dated just 3 months ago, addressed to Thomas McCready, Cedar Falls, Montana Territory. Someone had discovered that the supposedly dead marshal was alive and living under his real name. "Your secret is safe with me for now," the letter read. "But my employer has long memories and longer reach. The Blackwood Mining Company has not forgotten the trouble you caused, and they have not forgiven. Your new life, your family, your peaceful existence, it can all disappear as quickly as your old identity did. Unless, of course, you are willing to cooperate. Ignore this message, and your daughter will learn what happened to your previous children." Emily dropped the letter as if it had burned her fingers. Previous children, the family in the photograph, they had been her father's first family, and something terrible had happened to them. She looked again at the photograph, studying the faces of the 2 children who would have been her half-siblings. Their eyes held the same determination she saw in her father's face, the same stubborn courage that she felt stirring in her own heart. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting longer shadows across her small room, Emily realized that her discovery had changed everything. Her father wasn't just a simple lumberjack who had always lived in Cedar Falls. He was a hero who had sacrificed everything to fight for justice, and now that same fight had followed him to their home. The question that burned in her mind wasn't whether she should tell her parents about the box. It was whether she was brave enough to help them face the danger that was already closing in around their family. As she carefully repacked the documents and prepared to confront her father with the truth, Emily felt the weight of her 8 years and the emerging strength of someone much older. Whiskers appeared at her bedroom door, his green eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. He had led her to this discovery for a reason, and now Emily understood that she had a choice to make. She could pretend she had never found the box, never learned the truth, and hope that the danger would pass them by. Or she could find the courage to stand with her father, to help him face the enemies who threatened not just their family, but all the innocent families in Cedar Falls, who had no idea that the same forces that had terrorized other communities were now setting their sights on their peaceful town. As darkness began to fall over the Montana forest, Emily made her decision. Tomorrow she would show her father what she had found, and together they would decide how to protect their family and their community. The little girl who had followed a cat into the forest that morning was gone. In her place sat a young person who understood that sometimes even children had to be brave enough to fight for what was right. The breakfast table had never felt so heavy with unspoken words. Emily sat across from her father, the mysterious box hidden beneath her bed upstairs, its secrets burning in her mind like a fever. Thomas McCready ate his eggs and bacon with the same steady calm he brought to everything, but this morning Emily saw something different in his weathered face, a tension around his eyes, a way his gaze occasionally drifted to the window as if watching for something. Her mother, Sarah, moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, but Emily noticed how her hands lingered on her father's shoulder as she refilled his coffee cup, a gesture of comfort that suggested she, too, sensed something troubling in the air. "Papa," Emily said, her voice smaller than she intended. "I need to show you something." Thomas looked up from his plate, his deep brown eyes focusing on his daughter, with the attention he always gave her when she spoke. "What is it, little one?" Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. She had practiced this conversation in her mind all night, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt too big for her mouth. "It's upstairs. Something I found yesterday when I followed Whiskers into the forest." She saw it then, a flash of something in her father's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he had been expecting this conversation for a long time. "Show me," he said simply, setting down his fork and following her up the narrow wooden stairs to her small bedroom. Emily pulled the box from beneath her bed, noting how her father's face went completely still when he saw it. His hands, usually so steady and strong, trembled slightly as she placed it on her dresser. "Where exactly did you find this?" His voice was quiet, controlled, but Emily could hear the emotion beneath the surface. "Under the big oak tree, about a mile into the forest. Whiskers led me right to it, Papa, like he knew it was there." Emily opened the box, revealing the documents and photograph. "Papa, is this you?" Thomas McCready stared at the photograph of himself in a marshal's uniform, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the distant sound of birds chirping outside the window. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of hidden pain. "Yes, Emily, that's me. And those children." He picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. "Those were your brother and sister." Emily felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. "Were?" Thomas sat heavily on her small bed, suddenly looking much older than his 42 years. "The Blackwood Mining Company didn't just steal land, Emily. When families resisted, when people like me got too close to exposing them, they made those people disappear. My first family. Your mother and I thought we were safe in Colorado territory. I was doing my job, fighting for justice, protecting innocent families." His voice broke, and Emily saw tears in her father's eyes for the first time in her life. "One night, while I was away gathering evidence against them, men came to our house. My wife Margaret, your brother Samuel, and your sister Rose. They set fire to the house with them inside, made it look like an accident. By the time I returned..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Emily moved to sit beside her father, her small hand finding his large, calloused one. "So you became someone else?" "I had to. The Territorial Marshal Service helped me fake my death, gave me a new identity, helped me disappear. But then I met your mother, and when you were born—" He looked at Emily with such love and pain in his eyes. "I thought we were safe. I thought we were far enough away, hidden enough. I should have destroyed that box years ago, but those documents were the only proof of what the Blackwood Company did, the only evidence of their crimes." Emily pulled out the recent letter, the one that had mentioned her and threatened her father. "Papa, they found us. They know you're alive." Thomas read the letter, his jaw tightening with each word. "How long ago did you find this?" "Yesterday morning." "Papa, what does this mean? What are they going to do?" Before Thomas could answer, Sarah's voice called up from downstairs. "Thomas! Emily! You need to come down here now!" The urgency in her mother's voice sent a chill down Emily's spine. She and her father exchanged a look of understanding. Whatever was happening downstairs was connected to the secrets they had just shared. They hurried down to find Sarah standing at the front window, her face pale with fear. "There are men approaching the house," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "3 of them armed, and they don't look like they're here for lumber." Thomas moved to the window, and Emily saw his entire body go rigid. "Sarah, take Emily and go out the back. Head for the Thompson farm and don't look back." "I'm not leaving you," Sarah said firmly. "And I'm not leaving either of you," Emily added, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Thomas looked at his 8-year-old daughter, seeing something in her face that reminded him of the children in the photograph upstairs. "Emily, this is too dangerous." "Papa, I read all the documents. I know what they did to your first family, and I know they're here to do the same to us." Emily moved to stand beside her parents at the window. "But I also know that you're the bravest man in Montana territory, and if we run now, they'll just follow us again. We have to stop running." The 3 riders had reached their front gate. Emily could see that they were exactly what her father's old documents had described: hard men with guns, the kind who enforced their will through intimidation and violence. But they had made one mistake. They had underestimated the family they were threatening. "Thomas McCready!" the lead rider called out, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "We know you're in there. We know who you are, and we know what you have. Come out, and maybe your family walks away from this." Thomas stepped away from the window and moved to a chest in the corner of the room. Emily watched in fascination as he opened it and removed items she had never seen before: his old marshal's badge, a gun belt with a well-maintained revolver, and a rifle that looked like it had seen considerable use. "Papa," Emily whispered. "Sometimes, little one, running isn't enough. Sometimes you have to stand and fight." He strapped on the gun belt with the practiced ease of a man who had worn it for years. "Your mother and I have been preparing for this day since we arrived in Cedar Falls. We have friends in this town, good people who know the truth about what's happening." As if summoned by his words, Emily heard the sound of horses approaching from multiple directions. Through the windows, she could see that the 3 men who had come to threaten them were now surrounded by a dozen riders. Townspeople she recognized, including Mr. Thompson, Mr. Rodriguez from the general store, and several other men her father had worked with at the lumber mill. "The difference between now and 12 years ago," Thomas said, checking his revolver with practiced efficiency, "is that this time, I'm not alone. This time, we have a community that's ready to fight back." Emily felt a surge of pride and fear as she watched her father transform from the gentle lumberjack she had always known into the lawman he had once been. But more than that, she felt the stirring of her own courage, the understanding that she, too, had a part to play in protecting her family and her community. "What do you need me to do, Papa?" she asked, her voice steady and strong. Thomas McCready looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just a child, but a young person with the heart of a fighter and the wisdom to understand that some battles couldn't be avoided. "I need you to be brave, Emily. And I need you to remember that fighting for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." Then, as the confrontation outside their cabin prepared to unfold, Emily understood that her discovery of the buried box had been more than just uncovering family secrets. It had been the beginning of her family's fight to reclaim their right to live in peace, and their determination to ensure that the Blackwood Mining Company's reign of terror would finally come to an end. The little girl who had followed a cat into the forest was gone. In her place stood a young person ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she carried within her the courage of a father who had never stopped fighting for justice and the love of a family that would never again run from the truth. The standoff lasted less than an hour, but it changed Cedar Falls forever. Emily watched from the cabin window as her father stepped onto the front porch, his marshal's badge gleaming in the morning sunlight for the first time in over a decade. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the quiet lumberjack, replaced by a man who carried himself with the authority of someone who had spent years upholding the law. "I'm Thomas McCready," he called out to the three mounted men, his voice carrying across the clearing with unmistakable strength. "I know why you're here, and I know who sent you." The lead rider, a hard-faced man with a scar running down his left cheek, sneered as he responded. "Then you know you got two choices, McCready. Come with us quiet-like, or we make this hard on everyone you care about." What the man didn't expect was Thomas's response. A low, confident chuckle. "You boys are making a mistake," Thomas said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "See, 12 years ago, when you murdered my family, I was alone, had to fake my death just to survive, but things are different now." As if responding to a signal, the townspeople who had been positioned around the property stepped into view. Emily counted at least 15 men, all armed, all with expressions of grim determination. These weren't professional gunfighters, but they were something more powerful. They were neighbors protecting their community. Mr. Thompson, whose farm bordered their property, spoke up from his position near the barn. "We know what your company's been doing. The Johnson family didn't leave because of drought. You burned their crops. The Martinez family didn't sell because they wanted to. You threatened their children. We've been documenting everything," added Mr. Rodriguez, holding up a thick folder of papers. "Every intimidation, every accident, every family forced to sell below market value. We know about the Blackwood Mining Company, and we know about the corruption you bring wherever you go." Emily saw the confidence drain from the faces of the three riders as they realized they weren't dealing with an isolated family, but with an entire community that had organized against them. The scar-faced leader's hand moved toward his weapon, but stopped when he saw how outnumbered they were. "You can't prove nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. That's when Emily made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She opened the front door and walked onto the porch, carrying the wooden box that contained all the evidence of the Blackwood Company's crimes. "Actually," she said, her 8-year-old voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "we can prove everything." "Emily, get back inside," her father said urgently, but Emily stood her ground, opening the box and holding up the documents for everyone to see. "These papers show every crime the Blackwood Mining Company committed in Colorado Territory. Every family they hurt, every house they burned, every life they destroyed, including my brother and sister." The silence that followed was profound. Even the three riders seemed stunned by the courage of the small girl who faced them without flinching. "My papa tried to stop you before, and you killed his family for it," Emily continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But you made one mistake. You let him live, and now he's here with people who won't let you hurt anyone else." Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward, his own documents in hand. "We've been in contact with the Territorial Marshal Service for months. They're very interested in these Blackwood Company activities, especially since they thought Marshal Thomas McCready was dead." The scar-faced rider's horse shifted nervously, sensing his rider's growing agitation. "This ain't over, Macready. The company's got resources you can't imagine." "Maybe," Thomas replied, his voice steady and calm. "But they don't have what we have here. They don't have a community that stands together. They don't have people who are willing to fight for what's right instead of what's profitable." As if to emphasize his point, more riders appeared on the horizon. Emily squinted against the morning sun and felt her heart leap with excitement as she recognized the uniforms and badges of territorial marshals. A full squad of lawmen was approaching, led by a man whose silver hair and commanding presence marked him as someone of significant authority. "Marshal Macready," the silver-haired man called out as he rode up to the cabin. "Captain Morrison sends his regards, says it's about time we finished what you started 12 years ago." The three Blackwood riders found themselves completely surrounded now, facing not just an armed community, but official representatives of territorial law. The scar-faced leader's defiance crumbled as he realized the situation was hopeless. "We want to make a deal," he said desperately. "The only deal you're getting," Captain Morrison replied as his marshals moved to surround the men, "is a fair trial before you hang for murder. We've been tracking the Blackwood Company's activities across 3 territories. Thanks to the evidence that Marshal Macready preserved and the documentation this community has provided, we finally have enough to bring them all down." As the 3 men were taken into custody, Emily felt a profound sense of completion. The box that Whiskers had led her to discover had contained more than family secrets. It had contained the key to justice for not just her father's first family, but for dozens of families across the territories who had suffered under the Blackwood Company's reign of terror. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. More marshals arrived along with a territorial judge who had been investigating the company's activities. The cabin became an impromptu courthouse as testimonies were recorded, evidence was catalogued, and the full scope of the Blackwood Mining Company's crimes was finally brought to light. Emily sat on the porch steps, watching the proceedings with a sense of wonder and pride. Her father, no longer hiding his true identity, worked alongside the marshals with the efficiency of a man who had never really stopped being a lawman. Her mother moved among the townspeople, offering coffee and food to those who had stood with their family. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the Montana landscape, Captain Morrison approached Emily with a smile. "Young lady," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "your courage today helped bring justice to a lot of families who thought they'd never see it. Your father would be proud, but I think you've got plenty to be proud of yourself." Emily looked up at the experienced lawman, then toward her father, who was sharing a moment of quiet conversation with some of the townspeople who had risked everything to stand with their family. "Captain Morrison," she said thoughtfully, "what happens to my papa now? Does he have to go back to being a marshal?" The captain knelt down to her level, his weathered face kind but serious. "That's up to him, Miss Emily. But I suspect Cedar Falls is going to need someone to wear a badge and keep the peace, now that the Blackwood Company won't be threatening folks anymore. Seems to me your father's found himself a community worth protecting." As if hearing his words, Thomas Macready approached them, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. The marshal's badge still gleamed on his chest, but his expression was that of a man who had finally found peace. "Emily," he said, kneeling beside her on the porch steps, "I want you to know that what you did today, your courage, your wisdom, your willingness to stand up for what's right, that made all the difference. You helped save not just our family, but this entire community." Emily leaned against her father's strong shoulder, feeling the solid weight of the badge against her cheek. "Papa, are we safe now?" "We're safe, little one. And more than that, we're home. Really home, for the first time in 12 years. As the last of the marshals prepared to leave, taking their prisoners toward territorial justice, Emily reflected on the strange journey that had begun with following a cat into the forest. She had started the day as a curious child, but she was ending it as someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what was right, despite being afraid. Whiskers appeared beside her on the porch, purring softly as if he too understood that his mysterious mission had been completed. Emily scratched behind his ears, wondering if he had somehow known what was buried beneath that ancient oak, or if he had simply sensed that his family needed him to lead them toward the truth. The stars were beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky as the McCready family, no longer hiding, no longer running, no longer afraid, settled into their first evening of true peace in over a decade. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as her father took on the role of Cedar Falls official marshal and worked to rebuild the trust and security that the Blackwood Company had tried to destroy. But tonight, Emily McCready sat on her family's porch, surrounded by the love of parents who had taught her that justice was worth fighting for, and a community that had proven that when good people stand together, they can overcome even the most powerful forces of corruption and fear. The brave lumberjack's little girl had followed a cat into the forest and discovered something that changed her life forever. Not just the secrets of her family's past, but the strength of her own courage and the power of standing up for what's right, no matter how small you might be or how big the enemies you face. In the years that would follow, Emily McCready would grow into a woman who never forgot the lessons of that transformative day. That truth has a way of emerging from even the deepest hiding places, that communities are strongest when they protect their most vulnerable members, and that sometimes the most important discoveries are made by those brave enough to follow an unexpected path into the unknown. But all of that lay in the future. For now, she was simply a girl who had helped her family find their way home, surrounded by the vast beauty of the Montana wilderness and the warm knowledge that justice, though sometimes delayed, would always find a way to prevail.